The air in the palace smelled of incense and old wood, but beneath it all was the unmistakable scent of death. King Adebemi lay on his bed, his breath shallow, his skin pale like the morning mist. The great warrior, the ruler of Yet Kingdom, the man who had commanded armies and silenced rebellions with a single word, was now a frail shadow of himself. His 3 sons stood before him, Olamide, Adetayo, and Jide. The tension in the room was thick, but none of them spoke. Even the queen, standing by the door, clutched her wrapper tightly, her knuckles white. The palace elders had gathered outside, waiting for the inevitable. The kingdom was about to lose its king. What no one knew was that they were also about to lose something greater, the truth they had believed for years. King Adebemi struggled to sit up. His eyes, once sharp as an eagle's, now looked distant, haunted by a secret too heavy to carry to the afterlife. He raised a trembling hand, pointing at Olamide, the son he had always called adopted. "My son, my first son," the king whispered. Olamide frowned. He had heard wrong. He must have. The entire room fell silent. "You were never adopted." The king's voice cracked. "You are my blood, my firstborn." The queen gasped. Adetayo's body stiffened. Jide's face twisted in confusion. Olamide felt his heart stop. The words did not make sense. His whole life, he had been told otherwise. He had carried the shame of being an outsider, of not truly belonging. He had used it to escape responsibilities, to stay in the background while Adetayo carried the weight of being the heir. Now, with a single breath, the king had shattered everything. But you told everyone," Olamide stammered. "I lied," the king confessed, his voice barely above a whisper. "I had an affair. You were born from it. I hid the truth from the queen, from everyone." He coughed violently, blood staining his lips. "I thought I was protecting you, protecting the kingdom." The silence in the room was deafening. The queen staggered back as if the words had struck her. Adetayo's fists clenched, his whole life crumbling in his hands. Olamide, the son who had always avoided responsibility, had just inherited the biggest one of all. The palace walls had never felt this suffocating. The king's confession hung in the air like thick smoke, choking everyone in the room. No one spoke. No one moved. It was as if time itself had frozen. Olamide stared at his father, his mind spinning. He had always been content to be the adopted son, the one without burdens. He had never envied Adetayo's role as the firstborn because it came with endless responsibilities. But now, everything was different. He was not adopted. He was the first son, the heir. Adetayo took a step forward, his face dark with emotion. His entire life had been built on a lie. He had been raised as the first son, carried the family's burdens, and prepared for the throne. Now, with a single confession, all of that had been taken from him. How could you do this?" he asked, his voice low but shaking. The king, weak and breathless, did not answer. Jide's sharp laughter cut through the silence. "This is madness," he said, shaking his head. "So all these years, Olamide has been playing the role of an outsider, dodging every responsibility, while Adetayo carried everything?" He scoffed. "And now, just because of blood, he suddenly wants to take the throne?" Olamide turned to him, his chest tightening. "I didn't ask for this," he said, his voice laced with uncertainty. Jide stepped forward, his eyes burning. "But you won't refuse it, will you?" His voice was bitter. "You won't say, no, let Adetayo keep the throne he prepared for his whole life. You will claim what you never worked for, what you never suffered for." Olamide swallowed hard. He had never seen Jide like this before. Adetayo remained silent, but the pain on his face was clear. The queen suddenly spoke, her voice trembling. "So you mean to tell me that I have been raising another woman's child under my roof while believing he was an orphan?" The king tried to reach for her, but his hands were too weak. Tears gathered in her eyes, but she quickly wiped them away, her dignity intact. "You betrayed me," she whispered, her voice cold. King Adebemi opened his mouth to speak, but his breath failed him. His body shuddered violently, and the palace physician rushed forward. "Your Majesty, hold on." But it was too late. The king let out a final shaky breath. His eyes, once fierce and commanding, now stared blankly at the ceiling. The room erupted in chaos. The queen let out a pained gasp and turned away. The palace maids began to wail. The elders outside, who had been waiting, bowed their heads as the bell of morning rang through the kingdom. The king was dead. And now the battle for the throne had begun. The palace was no longer a place of order. It was a battlefield of whispers, arguments, and heavy silence. The king had barely been buried when the matter of succession took center stage. The elders gathered in the great hall, their faces grim. The royal family sat before them, broken in different ways. Olamide, still struggling to understand his new reality, sat stiffly. He had spent his whole life avoiding responsibilities, but now the weight of the crown hovered over him like a shadow. He had never wanted to be king, but now that the throne was within his reach, he couldn't ignore it. Jide sat at the edge of his seat, his fingers tapping impatiently against the armrest. His anger had not cooled since their father's confession. If anything, it had grown into something sharper. He kept glancing at Adetayo, waiting for him to speak. But Adetayo said nothing. He sat still, his eyes fixed on the floor, his hands clenched together. His entire life had been built around his destiny as the next king. Now, that destiny had been stolen. The eldest chief, Baba Fayemi, cleared his throat. His voice was steady but firm. The king is dead. May his soul rest in peace. But we cannot allow disorder to enter the kingdom. We must decide the next ruler. A murmur swept through the elders. Some nodded in agreement. Others glanced at each other uncertainly. By birthright, the throne belongs to the first son, an elder spoke. His name was Chief Olowu, a strict traditionalist. He turned to Olamide. The king's confession has made it clear. Olamide is the firstborn, and as our custom dictates, he should be crowned king. Jide scoffed loudly. That would be the greatest mistake in the history of Yet Kingdom. All eyes turned to him. Jide leaned forward, his voice sharp. A king is not made by blood alone. A king is made by responsibility. Olamide spent his whole life avoiding responsibility. He has never carried the weight of this family, never made sacrifices for this kingdom. Why should he sit on the throne? Olamide's face grew hot. That is not fair. It is the truth, Jide snapped. When duties were shared, you ran. When our father called, you were never there. You cannot just walk in now and wear the crown because of a confession. The hall erupted in murmurs. Some elders nodded in agreement. Others looked uncomfortable. Chief Olowu raised his hand, silencing the noise. He turned to Adetayo. Prince Adetayo, what do you say? Do you challenge your brother's claim? All eyes were on him. For a long time, Adetayo remained silent. He slowly lifted his head, his eyes dull with exhaustion. He looked at Olamide, then at Jide, then at the elders. I have nothing to say, he murmured. The hall fell into shocked silence. Jide's jaw tightened. He turned to Adetayo, his voice low and sharp. You have nothing to say? After everything? After all you have done for this family, all the sacrifices you made? Adetayo looked away. What does it matter? He whispered. The decision has already been made. Jide slammed his fist on the table. No, this is not over. He turned to the elders, his voice ringing through the hall. If Adetayo will not fight, then I will fight for him. Olamide cannot sit on that throne. The elders gasped. The room burst into heated arguments. Olamide sat frozen, feeling the weight of his brother's words. The battle for the throne had begun. The palace was in turmoil. The news of the succession battle had spread beyond the walls of the great hall, spilling into the streets of Oyet Kingdom like wildfire. The people whispered in markets, in courtyards, and at riverbanks. Who would be king? The son who had always been treated as an outsider but was first by blood, or the one who had carried the burden of leadership all his life? Inside the palace, tension thickened with each passing day. The elders were divided. Some insisted that tradition must be followed. Olamide was the first son, and the throne was his by right. Others argued that kingship was more than birth. It was about leadership, and Adetayo had already proven himself. But Adetayo remained silent. He stayed in his chambers, refusing to meet with the elders, refusing to defend himself. His mind was a battlefield of emotions, betrayal, anger, exhaustion. He had lived for this throne, prepared for it, sacrificed for it, and now it was being taken from him like a toy snatched from a child. Jide, however, was not silent. He fought like a warrior, moving from elder to elder, reminding them of Olamide's years of irresponsibility. A king is not just a man, he argued. A king is a leader. A king is a father to his people. Olamide is no father, he is a runaway son. Olamide, on the other hand, had never felt more trapped. He had never asked for the throne, never prepared for it, yet now it was within his grasp. Would it be so wrong to take it? He was the firstborn. That was the rule. The king had confirmed it with his dying breath. Did that not mean something? But deep down, a part of him knew Jide was right. He had never carried the burden of their father's name. Adetayo had. On the 7th night after the king's death, the chief priest, a man who spoke for the gods, summoned the family to the sacred grove. The elders followed, torches in their hands, their faces unreadable. The final decision would be made. Olamide's heart pounded as they stood before the sacred shrine. The chief priest raised his staff, his voice deep and commanding. The gods do not see as men see. The gods do not count sons by blood alone, but by duty. He turned to Olamide, his piercing eyes unreadable. Prince Olamide, do you truly believe you have earned this throne? Olamide opened his mouth, but no words came. The chief priest did not wait for an answer. He turned to Adetayo. Prince Adetayo, do you claim the throne? Adetayo hesitated. Then he shook his head. No, gasps echoed through the sacred grove. Even Jide looked shocked. But, Adetayo continued, if a king must be chosen, let it be the man who has already borne the weight of the kingdom. Let it be the first son by responsibility, not just by birth. Silence fell. Then the chief priest nodded. The gods have spoken. Olamide felt a cold weight settle in his chest. The throne was no longer his. The silence in the sacred grove was deafening. The flames from the elders' torches flickered against the night, casting long shadows over the royal sons. The decision had been made. Olamide's throat was dry. He had spent his whole life running from responsibility. And now, when the greatest responsibility had finally caught up with him, it slipped through his fingers. The chief priest's words echoed in his mind. The gods do not count sons by blood alone, but by duty. Jide turned to Olamide, his face unreadable. There was no triumph in his eyes, only finality. Then he turned to Adetayo, who stood motionless, his expression calm but distant. Brother, do you hear them? The kingdom is yours. This is what you prepared for your whole life. The gods have confirmed it. Adetayo let out a slow breath. I never wanted to fight for what was already mine. The elders nodded in agreement, murmuring among themselves. Chief Olowu, the eldest among them, stepped forward and placed a firm hand on Adetayo's shoulder. Then let it be known before man and gods, Prince Adetayo, son of King Adigbemi, shall rule as the rightful king of Ye Kingdom. A murmur of approval swept through the gathering. Some elders turned to Olamide, gauging his reaction. He had lost. Would he fight? Would he protest? Olamide felt the weight of their stares. A part of him wanted to argue, to remind them that he was still the firstborn, that blood should count for something. But deep down, he knew the truth. Jide had been right all along. He had never earned the throne. He had spent his life using his supposed adoption as an excuse to avoid duty. Adetayo had lived as the first son, acted as the first son, and now he would rule as one. For the first time, Olamide bowed his head. Then let Adetayo be king. Jide exhaled in relief. The tension in the grove loosened, as if the very air had been waiting for this moment. The chief priest raised his staff. It is settled. The procession left the sacred grove in silence, returning to the palace where the kingdom awaited its new ruler. As they walked, Olamide stayed behind for a moment, watching as his brothers moved ahead. For the first time in his life, he understood what it meant to carry a burden. But it was not his to bear. And so, the throne of kingdom passed to Adetayo, not by birth, but by duty.